Okay, hello everybody. We're going to kick off on time. My name is Charles Grant from the Centre for European Reform. Welcome to this Fringe meeting on Britain's relationship with the European Union. We have 5 panellists today. One of them, Lucy Neville-Rolfe, I'm sure will be with us soon. But in no particular order, just left to the right, we have Juliet Samuel from the Daily Telegraph, Tom Tugendhat from the Foreign Affairs Committee of the House of Commons, Theresa Villiers, former Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Greg Hands, Energy Minister. Greg has to go quite soon to be on the big stage, so we're going to let him speak first, then we'll move into the panel discussion. The 3 men on this panel have something in common, if you count me as a member of the panel. We all have wives who are not UK citizens. One of them is from Belarus, one of them is from France, one of them is from Germany. I'll leave you to guess which wife belongs to which panel member.
The twitch is the clue.
Now, let me start off with just a 30-second report of the Fringe meeting we had in Brighton last week at the Labour Party conference. To my surprise, when we had a panel of Lisa Nandy, Hilary Benn and Jenny Chapman, they all agreed that Britain should not rejoin the single market or the customs union or reinstitute freedom of movement. So in fact, the position of the Labour leadership, and they did speak for the Labour leadership, is perhaps not so different from that of the Tory leadership as one might have imagined. But anyway, that's enough from me. I just pass that on anecdotally. I now turn to Greg Hands for some opening remarks. Greg, thanks very much for coming along today. Good to see you again.
Well, thank you, Charles. And can everybody hear me okay? Do you want me to do it from here or from the podium? I'll do it from here, yeah? First of all, my apologies for having to leave almost instantly. What's happened this year with conference is the inverse of what normally happens. Normally you set the main programme in the main sort of conference hall, and then later on the fringes fit in around it. But due to, I think, reshuffle, COVID rules, etc., it's kind of been the other way around this year. So unfortunately, the main kind of show has kind of imposed here on the Fringe programme. But look, a few things to say. First of all, amongst friends, 5.5 years now since the referendum. I mean, that is a long, long time. In that time, we've had 3 UK prime ministers, we've had 3 US presidents, we've had 2 French presidents, we've had 3 Japanese prime ministers, admittedly only 1 German chancellor, but nonetheless, I'm trying to give some kind of perspective, if you like, historically, for how far behind us the referendum now is. I'm not for a moment denying that it's still causing ripples today throughout politics, but I think we should bear in mind just kind of what a historic event the referendum itself has become. I think we should be charting a vigorous but pragmatic course based on a relationship of sovereign equals. And a very good starting point is the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, which I think is a good agreement. It's the deepest, from my previous world of free trade agreements, the most deepest and comprehensive free trade agreement that there is in the world today is that between the European Union and the United Kingdom. I think we should reject, if you like, the 2 paths out on the edges. I think Charles very interestingly mentioned Labour conference, but I think any sort of path to rejoin, I think, will be rejected by the British people. And we all kind of, you occasionally see these polls that crop up, if you reran the question or what the question might be today, and things have moved a little bit. But I fundamentally believe that any move like that would be rejected. I don't think it will happen in my lifetime, and I don't think that any major party will advocate rejoining the EU, certainly for 10 years. By the next election in 2024, the UK, we would expect to see the UK in the CPTPP free trade area, the Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, a 4-continent, 11-country free trade area. Be very difficult to see how either rejoining the EU, the customs union, or the single market would be compatible with being in CPTPP. We'll have free trade agreements with Australia, with New Zealand, potentially with India, the United States, and others by the time of the next general election. We already have our own independent migration policy. All of these things, I think, will be incredibly difficult for any major political party, in other words, the 2 major political parties, to advocate doing things that I think will reverse any of those things that are going to happen between now and the next election. However, I do think at the same time we want to have a relationship with the European Union that is strong, and a relationship that actually needs a lot of investment. It needs time, it needs people, it needs face time. I used to go for many years to the Trade Foreign Affairs Committee of the European Union, and used to regularly engage with trade ministers like Peter Altmaier from Germany, through to Frank Riester from France, all the others. And it worries me now that we don't have as much direct interaction. I think we need to do more as a country and as a political system to increase and improve our engagement with our European partners. I think you've got to invest the time and effort into doing it, and that I think is going to be the way forward. Obviously, at the moment, there's still outstanding issues there, but I don't think those outstanding issues should prevent keeping up excellent relations with our member state and Brussels counterparts. So what else should we do? First, I think we should be ready to diverge. There should be a relentless focus in the UK on what is going to be in the UK national interest. For example, we talked in financial services before the referendum, long before, about a lot of EU regulation being unhelpful for UK financial services industries. We should absolutely be ready to diverge in that area, in an area of crucial national interest. It's not necessarily a question about deregulation. It often gets dressed up, is the UK going to deregulate? Are we going to become a Singapore on the Thames? Actually, in some areas, we will go further than the European Union. I know Theresa will almost certainly talk about how we treat animals in this country. But climate change mitigations, other things, I think we will go further than the European Union. We'll do more trade deals. Australia, New Zealand, CPTPP, others, I think, coming forward as well. I think that is an area where the UK, having spent in that trade fact meetings of the European Union, and I was always, the UK voice was the most pro-free trade. I know because I was the voice. And actually, the opportunity to pursue a free trade agenda should definitely not be missed. I think at the same time that we can be learning a lot more from our peer group. I don't think we do enough in this country, successive governments, to engage with our European neighbours in particular. You know, they are, if you like, the economies and societies that are most similar to ours. I don't think we learn enough. I'm hearing, I've just done an industry roundtable hearing about the German government's hydrogen strategy. The UK, we've just published our own hydrogen strategy. I think we should be doing more to engage and to learn from our partners. You know, if you like, we are in many ways a set of similar economies. If you were in business, you'd be trying to learn from your friends and your rival businesses of about the same size, and I don't think we do that well enough in this country. So I think we should be engaging much more with both with Brussels and with our European counterparts. Absolutely build on cooperation in counterterrorism, fighting crime, environment, and all these other areas where our common interests are incredibly aligned. And of course, we should be building on our relationship there as well. So I would say we should be realistic. The path forward is as a positive vision, the strong cooperation between sovereign equals. It is neither treating the European Union as in some way a relationship which is in any way inferior to the relations we have elsewhere in the world, but nor is it trying to set a path to rejoin either the European Union in full or in part. So that would be how I would lay out, Charles, my vision for where the future UK-EU relationship should go. And at that point, I'll have to go back to the other part of the hall and get ready to get mic'd up to talk about energy. So thank you.
Thank you, Greg. Let's go along the panel from right to left. So I turn now to Theresa, who I think will say a little bit about the future of the Northern Ireland Protocol, which is undoubtedly the most difficult area remaining that still has to be sorted out in the UK-EU relationship. How does it look to you, Theresa, and what's the way forward?
Thank you, Charles. Well, can I first thank you and the Centre for European Reform and everyone in the room for coming to the Conservative Party conference. It can be a truly gruelling experience, so your presence here is really valued. And yes, Northern Ireland and the protocol are the unfinished business of Brexit. I think the problem started when the joint report was agreed by Theresa May in December 2017, making concessions in relation to Northern Ireland that the EU subsequently used to drive a very hard bargain. And the so-called Irish backstop that the joint report led to caused the greatest ever parliamentary defeat suffered by a government in this country, a year of Brexit crisis votes and the end of Mrs May's premiership. More than that, it was a drag anchor for the new Prime Minister Boris as he embarked on renegotiating the withdrawal agreement that his predecessor had secured. That he got any changes at all was a significant achievement after more or less everyone said that was impossible. But the mistakes made by his predecessor meant that his renegotiation was sort of more of a damage limitation exercise, and some really painful compromises were made on the Northern Ireland Protocol. And now I think there can be no doubt that the protocol is causing serious political instability in Northern Ireland. Now, the commitment of the vast majority of people in Northern Ireland to peace and democracy is resolute, and I don't see it being shaken by this. But recent years have demonstrated the fragility of the institutions created by the Belfast Agreement and the political relationships across parties that are essential for those institutions to function. And the anxiety felt about the barriers to trade between Britain and Northern Ireland go beyond inconvenience and potential economic damage. The abolition of customs duties and free movement of goods between the two islands is a fundamental part of the 1801 Articles of the Acts of Union between Britain and Ireland. Far from protecting the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, the protocol violates it because it's changed the status of Northern Ireland within the Union without asking for the consent of the people in a referendum. And of course, much of the tension has focused around application of so-called SPS checks on food coming from Britain to Northern Ireland. And if the full range of EU SPS checks are implemented, one sandwich or ready meal could require several certificates signed off by a vet, and a single lorry load of food could require hundreds of such certificates. Even with grace periods still in place, the Department of Agriculture in Stormont estimates that they're undertaking a staggering 20% of the total for SPS regulatory checks carried out anywhere across the EU. And Northern Ireland's chief veterinary officer has said that if there isn't some change, the number of food certificates required in Northern Ireland could almost match the total processed in the whole of the European Union. There are a range of flexibilities which Brussels could grant and still maintain the integrity of their single market and consistency with their legal order. For example, goods sent to Northern Ireland but not viewed as at risk of entering the EU single market already enjoy many exemptions from customs formalities. The same principle could apply to SPS checks for food destined for the supermarket shelf in Northern Ireland rather than onward transport to the south. And in my view, the EU's current approach to the protocol isn't consistent with its own treaty commitments. The free trade agreement concluded on Christmas Eve obliges the EU to take a proportionate and risk-based approach to border-related controls. It's also a long-established principles of the international rules on trade by which the EU is bound that SPS rules should be based on evidence and risk. The UK has food standards which are every bit as good as the EU's, arguably more rigorous in some instances, particularly in relation to animal welfare. So it's entirely disproportionate to impose the full rigour of one-size-fits-all SPS regime designed for places as diverse as Thailand and Peru on a country which has provided safe, high-quality, highly regulated food to the EU for decades. So my concern is that ever since the 2016 referendum, the EU has often seemed determined to view Northern Ireland through a lens focused solely on the nationalist side of the community. It's never given sufficient weight to unionist concerns, which I think it really ought to do if its professed concerns about the Belfast Agreement are to be more than just a cynical furtherance of their own negotiating objectives. Now I think there is a good plan on the table from Nobel Prize winner David Trimble: scrap the protocol and replace it with a system of mutual enforcement, whereby each side takes responsibility that ensuring only goods and food compliant with the destination country's requirements are allowed over the border. And I think if the EU's concern for stability and prosperity in the island of Ireland is genuine, this is the route they should take. I think there is a way to solve this, and I think that is the most important issue that now, for the moment, needs to be resolved in terms of our relationship between the United Kingdom and the European Union.
Thank you very much, Teresa. We don't have anyone from the EU on the panel, but we do have several people in the audience who are eminent ambassadors and members of Parliament of various EU member states. I hope they will perhaps answer you back on some of those points when we get to the discussion. I turn now to Tom. And Tom, I don't know exactly what you're going to say, but one question I would hope you would deal with in your 5 to 7 minutes is the issue of the lack of a structured relationship on foreign and defence policy between the UK and the EU and the TCA. Is it sustainable in the long run to have no forming relationship in that area?
So that wasn't what I was going to be covering, but it looks like I will now. Can I just start off by saying that I thought Greg set it out rather well. We've had several changes of government, and we're about to see the final big shift in European politics moving on from the Brexit referendum. And whoever ends up forming the new government in Germany, it's quite clear, I think, to all of us that the relationship is no longer based on the referendum, and it's based on the future. The reality is we've left. It's done. Now the question is, how do we move forward? And, you know, you can look at 3,000 years of European history and the UK's place within it. And there are various moments where some of your ancestors came and raided some of ours. And there are various moments when some of our ancestors were not altogether cooperative with some of yours. But there is a much longer period that is ignored by historians because it doesn't include people like Widukind and the great Saxon armies. It doesn't include the great kings who crusaded across Europe. It actually includes the quieter bits, those moments when we traded, when we married, when we cooperated in peaceful ways over 3,000 years. The challenge for us is to make sure that that is the establishment for the next 100 years and not those bits that the historians so love to write about. And so what does that mean for the relationship? Well, I think the relationship goes in two ways, of course. It goes both from the European Union towards us and, of course, us to our friends in Brussels. And there I think it's worth setting out a couple of very clear initial points. The first is that the closest, most integrated military relationship that the United Kingdom has outside the United States is with France. Our deputy commanders of each of our armies, of our divisions, of our air forces are each other's nationals. French pilots fly Royal Air Force jets every day, today, intercepting Russian bombers. British officers are currently commanding, or rather deputy commanders of, French ships around the world. The relationship is incredibly close and very, very integrated. The second is on intelligence partnership, and here it's not always appreciated. One of the closest intelligence partnerships that the UK has outside the Five Eyes community is with Germany. When we were instrumental in setting up the German intelligence services in the aftermath of the Second World War, that relationship has endured. And the partnership that we have on counter-terrorism, on operations within Europe and actually without, all around the world, is incredibly close. So this isn't simply a relationship about trade. It's not simply a relationship about visas. It's a relationship that has kept all of us safe and has enabled all of us to extend the boundaries of our freedom and the strategic envelope that keeps us defended together. And so when we go into these conversations, I think it's just important to remember that these aren't haggles between trade partners. These are conversations between families. These are very, very deep and very complex negotiations that include much more than simply pounds, shillings, and pence. Now, to come to Charles's point, what does that mean for the structured relationship? Well, that's difficult. It's not a secret, but it is difficult. It's difficult because we've just voted to come out of a whole series of structured relationships, and it wouldn't be right for us to turn around and say, well, we must now go into another one that simply keeps us eternally aligned in a different way. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't have a permanent conversation. Just as we have with many of our partners around the world, establishing a proper, structured, integrated conversation that is able to carry on a discourse, not just a negotiation, is absolutely essential to make sure that when we get to those moments of friction, when we get to those moments when it's difficult, we've actually smoothed the discussion beforehand. And here I look at the US relationship. If you look at the British Embassy in Washington and the missions that we have around the United States, with consulates general in places like Texas and California, and even wilder places than that, these are conversations that mean that when we get to the tricky bits of a dialogue, we actually understand where we're coming from, and we're not surprised by the actions of each other, even if sometimes we're disappointed. And that's where I think we've got to really look hard at the Foreign Office's footprint in the European Union today. Because I think we do need to have a serious increase in our mission in Brussels, and I've argued in the past that I think we should think about having a minister resident in Brussels, a member of the government, an actual serving politician sitting in Brussels, attending cabinet in London when needed. You know, the Eurostar does work most of the time, not at the moment, but it does usually. And that is now entirely possible. So why not have a minister resident in Brussels? But not solely in Brussels. Why not also invest much more seriously in our bilateral relations? It's one of the things that's always struck me about the conversation that Brits have had about the European Union. We've always complained about the fact that we invest, or rather that everything is so centralized on Brussels, and in many ways I agree. But then we don't do the logical next step, which is to really invest in our missions in Bucharest, or in Berlin, or in Madrid. All of them, even Berlin, is too small for the task that we ask it to do. And so what do? We take the cheaper option. We talk to the centre. But the problem with the cheaper option is you only get the central view. And as anybody who's been to Washington knows, DC is a lovely place and it's got great museums. But it sure as hell isn't the same as Texas. And it's not just the boots that mark out the difference. It's the fact that the way that people look at things from different areas are very, very different. So if we're going to have a serious, structured conversation, as Charles raised, we need to have one that actually recognizes that the 27 states are not a single state, that actually the defense interests of Lithuania are not the same as Portugal, that the intelligence operations that we seek to conduct alongside our German brothers and sisters are not the same as those we're looking to work on with our French military partners. And we need to have a proper, nuanced and delegated series of engagements. Now, that's not possible unless we make the investment. So I think that, as far as I'm concerned, there is a huge possibility for greater cooperation with Britain and Europe, and some of it will be with the European Union. But if we limit it to being a question about Britain and the European Union, we're reducing it for both sides. The reality is that Britain has left, the engagement has changed, and the new relationship should be one of equals, yes, with the European Union, but also equals with the member states. Because each of them is sovereign too, and each of them has a voice that we all need to hear.
It's rather a shame then that, as my information is, the Foreign Office is contemplating quite big cuts to its bilateral missions across the EU.
As you know, I'm a regular supporter of the government. But
Yes, okay. Well, I can mention that anyway. Turn now to Juliet Samuel. Let's give you the microphone. What I like about Juliet's columns in the Telegraph is that sometimes they annoy Remainers, sometimes they annoy Leavers. And she annoys both sides in this debate, which is very I hope it's annoys both today, Juliet.
Well, thankfully, it's actually a while since I've had to write about Brexit, so I think COVID replaced it in that respect. We'd rather write about Brexit than that. But just to start off, I want to make the point on the back of Tom's remarks on engaging with individual countries, and I think that that's one of the major things that went wrong with the Brexit negotiation, was that we failed to understand not just the interests of individual states within Europe, but the culture and the approach and the way that anything that we said was being viewed across the continent, and all of the ripple effects that had on how the negotiation went. But I'm going to broadly take a bigger picture view, because I think that gets lost, has gotten lost since Brexit, which is that we fundamentally need a relationship of friendship with the EU. And I would define that as a recognition that despite many rivalries, we're on the same side fundamentally. And that might, at the moment, feel rather odd, because we've just spent 5 years arguing with the EU and emphasizing all of our differences, whether it's single market integrity versus pragmatism, or solidarity and harmonization versus competition, or to choose words that neither side would like, technocracy versus populism, whatever it is. But we actually need to zoom out from that and be more strategic in the way that we are managing this relationship. Because actually all of those arguments are really just a subset of a much bigger and more important argument that we're going to have whether we like it or not, that we're actually having or failing to have at the moment. It's being called the new Cold War, which I don't think is a very perfect name for it, and perhaps in time we'll find some other name. Perhaps it's a war of systems or a war of values. But fundamentally, the biggest fight of the next geopolitical era is between the values of China and the values of the US. And essentially, the EU and the UK are on the same side in that war. If we recognize our interests, manifestly we are on the US's side in that competition. And we share the fundamental values of human rights, representative democracy, the rule of law, and an independent judiciary, and market economies. And those are the things that get lost in these smaller arguments about regulations or about SPS checks on goods. And essentially, the Chinese state is offering a different proposition. And to put it in a nicer way than I would normally do, maybe a sort of paternalist authoritarianism is how one might call it. One where they offer order, one-party control, and subjection of the individual to the group, well, which effectively is what the CCP defines whatever the group is. But we have to actually realize that this system could win the argument. The outcome of this fight is not determined, and we're going to need each other. Freedom-loving countries are going to need each other in this competition. So we need to be strategic about that, and that from that come all sorts of things that define how our relationship should be. And our relationship at the moment has been sort of siphoned into a position by Brexit and by our internal matters, but we need to reshape it in the mold of what's happening in the world instead. And so what that means is more coordination on great international issues, whether it's reforming multilateral bodies, whether it's looking at our defense, whether it's things like if Russia mounts a chemical weapons attack on someone's territory, then you ideally coordinate sanctions together. If China is interfering in the civil societies of countries, then you share information, you build a picture of it across democracies, and you pool your resources on that particular issue. Or if a hostile country is pushing for a particular telecom standard in international regulation, that we coordinate our positions, that we understand that this may be a threat, not just to our interests, but to our values, and we therefore coordinate our positions before we go out into the world and just respond to them, or worse, not even have a response, which is seems to be the modus operandi at the moment. So the bad examples of what shouldn't happen are, leaving France out of AUKUS, however one pronounced it, for some reason that I can't really understand. Not just leaving them out, but doing so in the most aggravating way possible. And then on the other side, talking about the AstraZeneca vaccine in a way that is detrimental to all of our interests. Complete inflexibility over Northern Ireland, despite the issues that Theresa outlined. And then, more broadly, Nord Stream 2, the EU-China investment deal. And so I think that the issue that we face on those sorts of things is that the EU is potentially unable to think strategically in many of these areas because it has to balance so many interests. And so instead, you get drift. You get a lot of talk about strategic autonomy, which is purely vanity and has nothing behind it. And I saw a poll today, an interesting poll of Austrians that said, what do you think is the main purpose of the army? And 15% said defense, and 41% said disaster relief, which I think tells us exactly where our heads are in parts of Europe at the moment. So that's where we need to cooperate. areas where we need to have competition, or where we will have competition, having left the EU, which I think is perfectly healthy, are trade, tax levels, regulatory systems, you know, the war over talent. And I think that that is perfectly healthy, and, you know, so long as it doesn't degenerate too far into enmity, I think is a perfectly valid way for our relationship to develop. So I think that, and I also think that sometimes, you know, countries are going to use each other as a punch bag publicly, and they're going to say not very nice things about each other. And I don't think that's not broadly a huge problem. That's partly just how politics is. But I think that what's missing from the relationship at the moment is any broad idea of the fact that we are allies, we are on the same side, and we are going to need each other in the future.
Thank you very much, Juliet. I turn now to Lucy Neville-Rolfe, who is not only a former business minister, but also somebody who's worked at the highest levels of the retail industry. So, Lucy, how does the TCA look to you?
Charles, it's a great pleasure to speak on one of your panels because, of course, I was a supporter of the CER from its earliest days, when those of us who worked across Europe, and I was at Tesco trading across Europe, felt we could make the EU more competitive and less bureaucratic and open up Eastern Europe and change the paradigm. And indeed, on referendum day, I remember it well, I was returning from Mexico because I've been subbing for Matt Hancock at some international event. And when I left the tarmac with the German minister, Nigel Farage had just conceded defeat, so the German minister was very happy. And when I woke up in flight, David Cameron had resigned, the pound and the stock market were on the slide, and the German minister put his arm around me and behaved as though I'd had a bereavement. It was a very nice change because usually I encountered him because we were in the Competitiveness Council together, and he and a bright young Frenchman called Emmanuel Macron worked very closely together in a protectionist direction. Now, I wanted to make 3 points about our relations with the EU from a long career, as it were, facing them and within them. First, it was very appropriate while we were members to act constructively. We had to build coalitions, and we had to play a long-term game of influence and collaboration. So, for example, I pioneered a like-minded group of the smaller northern member states. We dined together before council meetings. We made terrific advances in the single market. But this isn't necessarily the way to get things done from the outside, because European solidarity acts against you once you're outside. Second, I think it was a mistake when we were leaving the EU to seek to be over-friendly. Divorcing partners can perhaps be friends one day, but the time to suggest it is not while the divorce is being negotiated. Unfortunately, Mrs. May's approach, particularly her agreement in the interests of so-called good relations to divide the negotiations into the two parts, was a predictable and I think a predicted disaster. So we allowed the EU to gain hugely on money, on citizenship, and on Northern Ireland, so the first phase. I think we should have taken a much tougher line from day one, perhaps leaving early and without agreement if need be. But unfortunately, such an approach requires a lot of nerve and a belief in the object of the negotiation, and it was very difficult in UK politics. Now, these early errors, which I don't think Cameron or Johnson would actually have made quite the same mistakes, were detrimental. And after agreement was reached, unfortunately, the EU in general, and in particular, has continued, I think, to be discourteous, sometimes to the point of unpleasantness. Julie, Juliet, you mentioned the treatment of the AstraZeneca point, which was one of the examples. Then there's threatening to cut off electricity. There's vaccines. Remember the threat on vaccines? So I think they've rather forgotten. I mean, collaboration's got to be both ways. So they will not agree to technical changes. Teresa knows much more about it than me, but in the UK-EU Joint Committee, which was actually set up to deal with detailed problems, as I remember, for just such things as sausages. And the EU have imposed their full bureaucracy of import controls on our goods, even though standards are largely aligned. There's a dog-in-the-mangerishness about the inconvenience to our music industry and trying to attract our financial services businesses to their capitals. And most of this hurts EU economic interests and EU citizens as much as it does us. So it's not in our interest, I don't think, to let this pass by, despite what you may read in some newspapers. Now, where the EU are unreasonably difficult, I think we have to be robust. So I am behind David Frost, who I don't think has been much mentioned in defending our own interest. There's uproar in France over the application of agreed rules on fishing licenses, yet we continue to allow imports from the continent without new controls, which does help the retail industry, I must say, but for a further period, and we require our exporters to Europe to suffer repeated and deliberate slowness and aggression. So I'm suggesting that we need a tougher line in negotiations starting now on the residual aspects of Brexit. And I think the government seems to be coming to that view, because we heard some of this from David Frost today. I mean, it's going to lead to rows, and EU supporters in the media will make a fuss. But with an 80-seat majority in Parliament, it seems to me it's the time to take the strain and to get this right. And I think we need to be independent-minded as well, which is why I welcome Lord Frost and Michael Ellis's recent common statements on the creation of opportunities post-Brexit. Things like gene editing, simplifying the bulk of financial services, micro-regulation, and the one-in, one-out system, which I think was inspired by the work of the Tigger report. I mean, let's see what it actually produces. I've been against over-regulation and bureaucracy all my life. But this is the right thing to think about, what advantages and opportunities you can get from a change of your international position. Now, I wouldn't like to conclude on that point, because I'd like to conclude on a more conciliatory note, because those of you who know me know I'm conciliatory. We need to remember, as has been said, that we are Europeans with a very long history, and a history of ups and of downs. And whilst the arrangements for the UK post-Brexit bed down, we need to keep relationships going away from the negotiations. So trade and investment is an obvious area. Somebody mentioned hydrogen rightly. Ad hoc defence and security cooperation, because as Tom says, we've got a lot, with all member states, we've got lots of close relationships on defence, intellectual, cultural and other exchanges, and of course marriages and indeed births will all continue across Europe. And nobody's mentioned parliamentary exchanges. I agree that we should have very strong diplomatic missions in all the 27 member states, but I think parliamentary exchanges can also be very valuable. We've got much to learn from each other, and Global Britain, of course, means continuing to understand each other in Europe. After all, according to the House of Lords Library, our biggest trading relationship, on some of the numbers, is with Germany, our second with China, and our third with the United States. Thank you.
Lucy. We've got plenty of time for comments, discussions, and I hope some good arguments as well. Let me just kick off with one point of my own while you're thinking what you want to say from the floor. Juliet talked a lot about China. Tom didn't talk about China, but usually talks about China.
I thought I'd give you a day off.
Yes, thank you. My question is this. If on big strategic matters, as Juliet says, we have little choice but to line up with America because of the values we share with them if there's a big conflict with China or if there's a new Cold War with China, and I think many continental Europeans would agree with that. But just to be devil's advocate, arguably the economic interests of many Europeans are rather different from those of the United States. It's quite hard for Europeans to cut themselves off from trade and investment with what will be soon the biggest economy in the world. It's easier for America to do that. So my question is really, is it possible to be cakeist? Can we Europeans have a good trading relationship with China and have investment with China, while at the same time on matters of human rights and geopolitics make quite clear that we're aligned up with the US and Australia and hopefully many European countries as well, and standing up for our principles and values? Or am I naive to believe we can be cakeist? Perhaps I'll turn first to Tom and see what others say.
Yeah, can I just say, I don't buy that at all, Charles. I don't buy it because actually the US relationship with China is equally as close as any other European country or any European country. If you look at simply the financial investments and the connections between Beijing and, I was going to say Washington, but probably more appropriately New York, you see a depth of relationship that frankly dwarfs any relationship that any European country has with China. And yes, of course it's true that countries, Germany is a classic example, but many other countries have a very close relationship with China. But the idea that this is somehow easier for America than it is for any of the European 27 or any of more larger European structures, I don't think is accurate. I think it's a very difficult problem for everybody. And the relationship with China and how we make it work is a real challenge for us all. Because actually, you know, if you're a Finnish telecom company, then how China decides to vote in the International Telecoms Union as a UN agency is fundamentally challenging to your business model. If you're a German car maker, how the Chinese battery firms decide to generate energy is fundamentally challenging to your economic model. Everything that we do at the moment as major industrialized countries, as international partners, as free countries, is actually fundamentally about standard setting within a global rules-based system. And what China is trying to do is to change those standards. Effectively, they're trying to reboot Apple and introduce, well, I was going to say another rival firm, but I mean, you know what I mean. They're trying to fundamentally rewrite the operating system of the global economy. Now, you may think it's a good thing to do. Personally, I'm not a statist communist, so I don't, but you may be. I mean, you're probably in the wrong gathering. There was Brighton is a bit further south from here. But if you do think that, it's perfectly valid to look at the way that Beijing is operating and believe in the centralized control and the speed with which a single dictatorship can accelerate towards a goal. That's absolutely valid. I happen to think it injects a level of fragility and instability into a system that is extremely dangerous. But you know, some people have those views. But the idea that Germany or Britain or Italy or Spain has a different view from the United States on this, fundamentally, economically in its own best interests, and based on the benefits of its free people, its free associations, its universities, and its businesses, is, I'm afraid, simply not true. The reality is the choice that the Republic of Ireland made, or Lithuania made, or Romania made, even in the late 90s, is the one that applies today, unless they wish to reboot the operating system of their economy in a very different way. And I don't see any of them trying to do so. What I instead see is people cautiously trying to ride two horses. And many have tried to ride two horses for, I think, longer than is really valid. And what we've had in the last 2 or 3 years is the kind of message that the Chinese ambassador in Stockholm gave to the Swedish people when he said that for our friends we have wine and roses and for our enemies we have shotguns. It was pretty sobering. And countries from Lithuania to the Czech Republic have woken up. Wolf warrior diplomacy has been extremely good for all of us, but not for China.
Thank you. Juliet, then others can come in if they wish.
The answer to your question is no. And I think it is a fundamental misunderstanding of how China views its relationship with other countries. The Chinese Communist Party, and I should specify the Chinese Communist Party because rather than China as a country of 1.5 billion people, Chinese Communist Party views its economic relations with other countries as an avenue for interference and control in their societies. It does not view them as a medium of free exchange. And one example of this would be, say, our universities. Our universities get a vast amount of fee income from Chinese students, which is great for their bottom lines. But the way that fee income is wielded as a weapon is something that's fundamentally against our interests and against our values. And that is everything from transfer of technology to shutting down debate on issues like Hong Kong. That is not a relationship that is in our interests or that is advantageous to us. It doesn't even allow us to have an exchange of ideas with the Chinese students who come here because They're all monitored by the Chinese embassy. They have to check in with handlers. They're not allowed to live integrated with other students. They all live together. They all eat together. So I don't really think that that's what I would understand by free exchange or free trade. And if you look more commercially at the experience of a company like American Semiconductor, which had a huge business in China until its technology was stolen and it nearly went bankrupt because a Chinese rival was set up offering its goods cheaper, and it's now embroiled in a court case in Beijing. So no, I don't think that's in our interests, and I think it's a fundamental misunderstanding of how the CCP views it.
Any other panelists like to comment on this? Teresa.
I'd like to have a go. I think my answer to your question is we do have to try to achieve that. So I'm probably not in quite the same place as Juliet or Tom. I mean, it's for our prosperity, for our ability to address catastrophic climate change, we've got to engage with and have a close relationship with China. I think there is just no getting away from that proposition. But at the same time, we have to find a way to manage the risks that come with that. Whether it's the security of our telecoms or the safety of our intellectual property and our science and development, there are a whole range of ways in which we should get better at protecting that. But I think in terms of the massive challenges that we face as a society, whether in the UK or the European Union, they're exactly the same. Our prosperity and our economy, it can be significantly boosted by our links with China. And as I say, well, for example, looking ahead to COP26, it'll succeed or fail in many respects, depending on the approach of China and a handful of other countries. So the idea of a new Cold War with China is just, I don't see it as a realistic route to go down. But absolutely, we have to be far more assiduous and vigilant than we have been up to now about protection of our security and our intellectual property and our businesses in terms of their relationships with China. And universities are an especially sensitive area where I think there needs to be far more alertness to the potential risks of that come with what is, I think, a necessary and ultimately a positive engagement with China.
I just make a more sort of business focus point. I mean, the truth is the rise of Asia is a reality, and China is part of that. And clearly we also need good relations with Japan, Southeast Asia, where I spend a lot of time, and with Australia. But of course the US trade with China to a vast extent, and so does all the significant countries in Europe. And China's difficult at the moment, at a political level, as it were. However, you need to maintain, I think, relationships at below that level. I mean, I used to be IP minister, and I remember going on 2 or 3 visits to China, and actually they were getting quite interested in IP, because as they began to have their own inventions and their own ideas, they began to realize that having judges to protect those rights was important. So I feel you need to continue to work away at these things in the hope that, the freezer will be a little bit less chilly in the long march of history.
Don't like Brussels single market. Wait till you taste Beijing's.
Okay. Thank you to the panel. Now there's a roving microphone. I'm going to shout as I'm between the 2 microphones. Who'd like to make a point or a comment or a question? It's gentleman over on my left.
So I like Lucy's point about having to drive a hard bargain with the EU. Do you think the EU are ready to move on with our relationship, or do you think there's still some time to go?
Did you want me to answer that?
That was a general question to the panel.
Well, I think you've got to, regrettably, my advice is you've got to actually up the ante in the same way that you're seeing the EU upping the ante whenever they think there's going to be a little bit of slippage on these agreements that have been pushed through. And that's because of my experience. First, I was a civil servant, and then I was in business in Brussels. And they're very good negotiators, a bit like the United States on trade negotiations. So to some extent, you've got to choose your. I mean, our guys are very good, but you've got to choose your areas, and you've got to be pretty tough. So that's why I support, I think, the general direction of travel, particularly trying to sort out Northern Ireland, which I'm not an expert on.
I would agree with that. I think the challenge is to not let the other stuff get lost while that happens, because the negotiation is, it's not going very well, and something needs to change in that. And I agree that the UK needs to defend its interests vigorously, and perhaps hasn't done so. But all this other stuff still needs to be happening. So how can we build ways to coordinate when we're having a huge fight over fishing on Northern Ireland on the other side? That's the difficulty.
I don't think many people on the EU side would say the British should be negotiating in a very soft and emollient way, but that, I'm not going to speak for them. We have a number of members of the German Parliament with us and other interesting people, and would they like to contribute? Starting with this gentleman here. You can wait for the microphone.
I regret that I don't come in either of those two categories. But
the night is young.
I know there are those behind me. I'm Keith Best. I'm Secretary of the European Movement in the UK. And obviously I endorse all the sentiments that have been raised about the need to engage more with the EU. And we've heard a lot about the mechanisms. But I just wondered if the panel could give us ideas on which particular subject areas would be the ones most amenable in order to actually try to re-engage with a slightly more Pacific than may have been the current attitude towards Europe, a slightly more collegiate approach to dealing with issues. And it seems to me we need to look at the low-hanging fruit. Where are the subjects that we can actually talk about in a more rational way?
Can I pick that up very quickly? Look, there are plenty of areas where we can engage on a cooperative basis, and not all of these, I know this is going to be surprising, but not all of these have to be done on a European basis. They can be done on a bilateral basis. And the great error, I think, that the UK government, and by the way, our European partners have made as well, is to treat it as a Westminster to Brussels conversation. It's not. It's a conversation between 450 million people, some of whom are represented at a larger scale by Brussels, some of whom are represented either by their national parliaments or in some cases by their landers or their communes or their régions. This is a conversation between peoples, not between institutions. And if you look at, for example, the free movement of people, I mean, on one level, this is a single European discussion, and of course it must be held at a European level. Right, okay, will you tell that to the Canadians who have various youth mobility schemes with Sweden but not Romania? You tell that to various people in the Republic of Ireland who, for example, have a free movement agreement with the UK but not with other places. These are the kind of conversations we need to be looking at the bilateral basis. And the UK itself, I'm afraid, has made the mistake of over-centralising the conversations on Brussels and under-engaging in conversations, whether in the Länder or indeed in the centre of various national capitals. And this is where we need to have these conversations, because actually, the truth is that our interests on finance is much more aligned in many ways with the Netherlands or with the Republic of Ireland than it is with Italy and Spain, for very obvious reasons, right? Our engagement on battery technology, for example, is much more engaged with many parts of Germany than it is with many parts of other European states. And so we need to have these conversations in different ways so that we can engage the low-hanging fruit, as you rightly put it. And sometimes Brussels will follow, sometimes Brussels will be supportive, sometimes Brussels will turn a blind eye, and sometimes Brussels will be angry. But this isn't a Brussels club. This is a club for 450 million people, and Brussels is one of the institutions within which this works.
Charles, can I
Teresa,
comment on that?
take the microphone if you could.
I'd like to sort of strike a note of optimism. In my opening remarks, I obviously focused on the big pressure point, and we do need to resolve the matters around the protocol. But the presence of that dispute shouldn't blind us to the fact that the Trade and Cooperation Agreement is unprecedented. It was a tremendous success to secure it, and it's operating so far exceptionally well. And so many of the potential negative consequences that people feared have not materialised, and that's a sign of both sides wanting to do the right thing, because it's always been in the interests of both the UK and the EU to retain a positive and constructive relationship. So, I mean, there will always be stresses and strains. The Emperor Charlemagne was writing stroppy letters to King Offa a millennium and a half ago about inadequate UK standards in the clothing that they were exporting to the European Union. So, and things like fisheries will no doubt continue to involve arguments sort of indefinitely. But I think on balance, we've set out on a successful path of cooperation with the European Union. Yes, there will always be fresh areas where we may want to step that up, and our approach to China may well be one of them. But I don't think that being conscious of the problem should blind us to the fact that in many ways our relationship with the European Union is going exceptionally well.
Okay. Geoffrey Van Orden, former member of the European Parliament, over to you.
Thank you very much, Charles, and very nice to see some old colleagues from other parts of Europe here. And I completely agree with this idea about we should be dealing with individual countries in Europe, not just with the EU. Some of us tried to make that point strongly to David Cameron, to mobilise more effort on embassies in the national capitals in Europe prior to the Brexit referendum. I just want to talk about the French, because I think, first of all, we should make more effort with the Germans. I've just come back from a couple of weeks in Berlin. Trouble is, by the way, that a lot of them just think we made some great strategic mistake, and they don't think there's any particular need to try and find ways around that or to be helpful towards us. So, and of course, the English newspapers they read are the FT and the Economist, and we all love the FT and the Economist, but on the question of Europe, all they do is feed this idea that we made this great mistake. But let me just get to the French question, because I mean, first of all, there's a degree of urgency about the Northern Ireland Protocol. Nothing's going to get sorted out with the French until May next year, when we have this minor matter of a French presidential election. So between now and May next year, the French are just going to be very difficult, or Macron is going to be very difficult with the UK. There are no votes in being nice to the English, as they see it from that point of view. And in any case, while, Tom, you're absolutely right, we do have these intimate military and wider defence and security relationships with so many continental countries, particularly with France. There seems to be a bifurcation in the French system. So we can deal with the MOD, but I'm not sure we can deal with the Quai d'Orsay. They seem to have a different view on these things. So why should we think that we can trust the French, for example, in the areas of defence and security, when in so many other areas of policy, they are treating us like sort of strategic enemies, going back centuries, if you like. So somehow or other, we've got to get the message over that there's a wholeness to this, that one area of policy, you can't treat us in one way, and in another area of policy, treat us in an entirely negative sort of way. So how are we going to reconcile this problem with the French?
Tom, over to you.
Well, I remember in 2003, in March, I was sent under the orders of the then Prime Minister and the President of the United States to invade Iraq. And shortly after that invasion, I was cleaning my weapon and listening to the BBC World Service, and this was about 48 hours after we'd crossed the border and begun to occupy this Middle Eastern state. And over the radio came the announcement that the United States Department of Commerce had slapped sanctions on British beef and would no longer be accepting the imports of UK meat products. So it's not just the French who have divisions within their government systems. I think I'm afraid to say every government has it. And my somewhat limited experience of the French presidential system is that if you were to ask them who they found easier to work with, they would say the military, but the Quai d'Orsay are a bunch of traitors too. You know, so it's not the first time that a national government says that its own foreign office, you know, I mean, Margaret Thatcher's line about the Foreign Office is that their job is to represent foreigners, which is not what I pay them for. You know, so this is not a unique relationship, and I have to say this is literally me sleeping in the doghouse, as my wife works for the French embassy, so you know, I'm in deep trouble. But look, I mean, I think you're right that the French are negotiating in various different ways in various different areas, and are seeking to maintain, if you like, the crown jewels, the strategic alliance on which their security and ours is fundamentally based, in a sort of compartment so that it isn't touched and isn't damaged. But what they're also trying to do is, completely extraordinarily for a sovereign state, they're trying to exert their sovereignty, to exert maximum leverage over us. And our job is to exert our sovereignty, to exert maximum leverage over them, not to complain that they're playing the game. I mean, they are. Now, I wish they didn't have 26 partners alongside them, but that was our choice to leave the club. So, you know, don't walk off the field and complain when the game goes against you. That's literally how games go, right? So what we've got to do is we've got to find different ways of exerting that leverage. And there are many other ways of doing it, because actually, if you look at, for example, the German reaction to the AUKUS deal, which was a staggering silence from Berlin, you can see that actually not everything is European. Not everything is to do with a single European entity. And different sovereign states have different sovereign interests, including those within a single European club.
Can I come in on this one?
Yes.
Because I think, I'd like to pick up this point about the sort of doing things outside the EU. I mean, you might be able to sort the music industry thing through the Council of Europe, some of the financial services issues, you know, that's now sort of world, Basel and so on, it's a world degree of coordination. But I think you're going to have to choose the moment. I mean, what I've found in many years of being part of the EU is that there are moments when Brussels comes together and has packages and so on. Those do not happen in the run-up to French elections. So, you know, you have to try and things, but there are things that could come together. The TCA does have some good things to it, but it does need some improvement on everything from sort of shellfish to parcels. And we've got to resolve the Northern Ireland Protocol some way or other so that the sausages flow. And there is areas of obvious cooperation like climate change and security, cooperation on crime, and to a lesser extent on defence. I think it's more difficult. And, you know, there's this issue of what kind of equivalence you have on city regulation, where there's been some things that are going to come to an end. So I think there is going to be an opportunity if one can get things into a better position. But I was saying I think you've got to sort of up the ante a bit to build pressure for a coming together.
Let's go to the gentleman here, just behind you, sir.
Hi there, Wolf Krug from the Hans Seidel Foundation, Munich. Tom, once again, congratulations to your great Afghanistan speech. You've been talking about the hard bits, trade, security, foreign relations. There are easy ways to re-establish friendships, relationships, which is, for example, student exchange. Unfortunately, you dropped out of Erasmus. I think this was a mistake, and I would strongly suggest to invest where it is easy. Student exchange, cultural exchange. Start there, and you'll make a lot of friends across Europe. That is not contentious, and that would be my first step to re-establish trusted, good, excellent relations with your European neighbors. Thank you.
I might add to that, there's the issue which you didn't mention about the school exchanges. I've heard from many of my German friends tell me they're very upset that because the British government now insists on identity cards are not allowed for school exchanges, you have to have a passport. School exchanges from Germany to Britain have basically just stopped, more or less for that reason. And I did see Lord Frost answer a question on that, and he wasn't very willing to change his mind on that issue. But anyway, that's enough for me. Who's got the next question? Gentleman at the front here.
What's most likely to happen regarding Northern Ireland in the coming years?
Well, I think, Theresa, would you like to pick up that one?
I think we have to have a replacement for the protocol, and the possibility of its being superseded is within the terms of the withdrawal agreement. But I think in its current form, it's just not working, and it's not just the friction with the checks and the compliance. It is not acceptable in the long term to have part of our country left in the single market and unable to, subject to an extremely long list of laws over which they have no vote and no control. So we do need an alternative solution. And as I mentioned in my opening remarks, I think the one put forward recently by David Trimble is probably the most viable. But it is, we simply can't carry on as we are. And I think David Frost is adopting the right approach to be pretty tough on this. I think ultimately a way will be found to address the problem, because it is in the interest of both sides that is what happens. So I am optimistic that we will find a workable alternative to the Northern Ireland Protocol. It may take time. And as Lucy says, it requires our negotiators to be robust. But I think it is deliverable, and it's certainly possible.
I'm going to add a word of my own here. I think that there are people on the EU side who do see the validity of some of the points that Theresa has made, and even that Lord Frost has made on the protocol. But they also consider that the way the British government has conducted itself has lost them goodwill and friends in Europe, and therefore those people in Europe who might actually agree with us on the substance are not so willing to help us in practice, because they consider that we haven't behaved in a very good way. But I don't speak for Europe now, just what I've been told. Now, there's a gentleman here from the Hans Seidel Foundation.
Yeah, thank you very much. Not only that, as well, member of European Parliament, and very happy to see Theresa again, and Geoffrey and others. Markus Weber from Germany and Bavaria. I will not solve the problem of Northern Ireland today, but I learned it always takes two to dance a tango, and it was not only European ideas what has been agreed, as it was agreed. And the other side, which is United Kingdom, agreed on that, and I'm very happy that you can buy the diaries of Michel Barnier in an English version in one of the shops over there. Maybe you get some insights over there how it worked. But honestly, I'm very happy what Tom said, because I think there are a lot of possibilities in cooperation bilaterally, not only listening what's happening in Brussels. For example, as what has mentioned already in youth exchange, Germany has special relations with their neighbors, with France, for historical reasons after World War II, now with Czech Republic, for example, especially we in Bavaria, after the end of the Iron Wall. And why not to do that? And there are a lot of possibilities. We spoke about military. Yeah, military cooperation has nothing to do with Brussels. Where is a new project between France, Germany, Italy, and United Kingdom, for example, to improve our air forces? And I could continue a long list on that, and I would appreciate if you could identify those points, because I couldn't agree more what Lucy said, as I had privately and politically the experience of a divorce. And I didn't want both of them, but things happen. But honestly, yes, we have to find a new way of how to live together and to improve that. That is more important than to identify what separates us. I think we have done that for years now, or even decades, enough. So I would appreciate to follow that road you have described. Thank you very much.
Anyone panelists like to respond to that?
Look, I mean, we train alongside the armies, navies, and air forces of the Netherlands and Estonia. I went into battle alongside Danish tanks and Estonian troops, and my unit trained the future King of Denmark. So, you know, the defence cooperation between us is exceptionally close. Different countries in different ways, but it is exceptionally close, and it's not something I'm particularly concerned about, in all honesty. I mean, Northern Ireland, I agree with Teresa. We do need to find a new way to make it work. I mean, it's worth remembering that before the United Kingdom joined the single market in 1992, there were border checks between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and if you tried to bring meat or fish or dairy products from Great Britain into Northern Ireland, they were incinerated by border guards at Larne and at the various points of embarkation and entry, because Northern Ireland, or rather the island of Ireland, operated a separate phytosanitary system to Great Britain. Now we've left the single market. Amazingly, those checks have come back. That's quite extraordinary, isn't it? So, you know, we've got to find a new way to make it work, and the real problem is to do with legitimacy, which is exactly as Teresa puts it, and we need to find ways in which Northern Ireland, or rather the people of Northern Ireland, have a voice. And as we know, Northern Ireland isn't quite like every other part of Great Britain, because the Good Friday Accord gives it a separate status. And so finding a way within which perhaps the Republic can find a way of giving voice within a European context. You know, there's various options that we need to discuss, but they need to be discussed openly and with good grace, and they need to include all communities. And I'm very proud to be going next weekend, I know this is a really extraordinary thing to do, but to another political party conference, this time the Ulster Unionist Party, which is now led by a very, very close friend of mine, Doug Beattie, who's an exceptional individual and who I had the great privilege of serving alongside in combat in Afghanistan. And his version of unionism, the inclusive, open unionism that includes people of all faiths and none of all communities in Northern Ireland, and looks at ways of solving problems, I think is a direction in which the people of Northern Ireland are certainly, so say the polls at the moment, and that's sorry, by which I mean the polling, not the people from Poland. That is the direction in which, although people from Poland may have a better insight into Northern Ireland than I do, that seems to be the direction in which the people of Northern Ireland are going. So look, I think there are options, but I think Lucy's absolutely right, and I think others are absolutely right, Charles is right, that we need to reset a relationship on which we can build trust and look for solutions. But part of that is to Lucy's point, look, finish the divorce, just get it over with. It may not be nice, but just finish it. And then you can move on to working out how you're going to walk your kids down the aisle in 20 years' time.
Gentleman here at the front, then we'll come to the back.
Hi, I'm a local councillor down in Hounslow. First of all, I entirely endorse the German gentleman's comments about the German educational and cultural exchanges. I'm also a member of the British-German Association, and I've been going along to those talks. And I myself, having gone to, I was very lucky at the age of 16 to go to Cologne and see the Chocoladefabrik and the beer there. During that at the age of 16, it's absolutely marvellous. But at the local government level, it's been really interesting to hear talks by the Mayor of Cardiff and the Mayor of Hamburg to describe the ways that they are making changes to local governments and how they're expanding their cities in a sort of green way. Sharing of that information has been extremely useful at local government level. It would be really interesting to hear more about what this government might do at local level for those cities and towns to sort of talk to each other and learn from each other right across the EU, just at local government level. That would be really interesting.
Okay, you want to respond, Teresa?
I have to say, I don't know what initiatives are underway, but obviously the system of town twinning has been a very successful way to build cultural links and links of friendship between towns in the UK and across Europe, and clearly that kind of cultural exchange is much to be encouraged, as is student exchange, and that's one of the reasons why we've created the Turing scholarships to enable that kind of thing to happen.
I mean, if there is this sort of desire, which I actually share, I used to be on the board of a company in Düsseldorf, I'm a European child, it would actually be very good to have programs, you know, as part of the future relationship between the UK and European companies. But we have, as I've said, we've got to sort the divorce. And then I think as part of the celebration of getting things into a better place, you can do more on student exchanges. I think pressure to just sort of get ahead to do those, to be friendly, which actually one thinks rather nice idea. It's a bit like, you know, you hand over the car and the divorce is still not finished. I think this is the difficulty we've got.
Right, can I just see who's still got a point to make from the floor? We can fit in the last few questions. Let's take a few together. Both these gentlemen here and then the other back.
Hi, I have a question just more generally speaking about foreign policy in regard to Europe. It seems to me that for as long as I can remember, which admittedly isn't very long because I'm quite young, we've pursued a foreign policy based off of going issue by issue instead of going for any particular strategy. And with the encroaching attempts of Russia and China to undermine the values that we stand for as a nation and that many of our European partners stand for, what more can we do as a term of necessity to work with European partners to protect against the encroachment of these authoritarian countries?
Okay, let's take the other gentleman near the back.
Thank you. I think Afghanistan is relevant to this conversation we've been having because it exposed the inability of us and our partners to act independently of the United States. Is that just a political reality that the UK now has to deal with, or is it something that we can and should rectify?
Anybody else want to make a final question? Yes, the gentleman over to my right.
I just wanted to make a point, really, that I work for a French company, Pernod Ricard, which makes a third of its turnover in the UK. We export over 1 billion, we employ over 2,000, and we work extremely well as a French company investing in Britain. And it would be important, I think, in this debate to remember the value of business in this relationship, and a time when the politics is necessarily difficult, because we are in this divorce, post-divorce, however you want to characterize it. But the scope to which an open trading and investment relationship forges those human links and shared innovation, which is very powerful for all of us.
Thank you. I think that's if there's no more questions, we'll come back to our panel. I'm just going to make one brief point of my own following from the last point, which is in the 23 years I've been running the Centre for European Reform, the bilateral relationship between the UK and France has, in my view, never been worse than it is now. With any objective assessment would blame both sides. Both sides have said and done things that they really should be slightly ashamed of. I'm not going to go into the details, but I think we all know that. And why does this matter? It matters for several reasons. One reason it matters is the Brexit process. One of the reasons why the EU appears to be quite hard and unyielding from a British point of view is because the French take quite a hard and unyielding line, partly because the bilateral relationship is so bad. Much more important than the Brexit issue, though, is the bigger picture about Russia and China, which we've talked about to some degree. If the West is divided, if the main European countries with a strong security relationship get on very badly and are throwing buns at each other, that is, the people who benefit most are the Russians and the Chinese and others who don't share our values. That's enough from me. Let's go back to the panel in inverse order. And conclude with Lucy first and moving in the other direction.
Can I just comment on the business? I've just commented on the business point, being a businesswoman, and say it is true that trade between Britain and France is incredibly important, and indeed between the other members, Italy and Germany and so on. And the French, lead the way on things like modular construction. They're building Hinkley for us. That's an EDF project, the nuclear facility. And that continues. And of course, we've been very open. We've allowed investments and so on to continue. So it does need to be a two-way thing. But I listen to Charles because he's always very wise, and that is a worrying sign.
I think on the question of how we can manage incursions or interference or threats from hostile states, I think one thing we could do is share information or even just compare notes on the playbook that is being unrolled in different places, because it's the same thing is happening to Czech universities as is happening to British universities, and the same thing is happening to technology companies in Germany, who tries to do business in China as would happen here. So I think that just sharing information to see a pattern is a start, and agreeing what your response might be, not necessarily coordinating sort of hard actions like sanctions, although that's one thing that would be good, but also just what the rules of the game are, broadly, so that other hostile states, China gets a consistent message that when you try to meddle in the affairs of a civil society of a free country, then this is what happens and a cost is incurred. So I think that there are a lot of ways that we can coordinate that don't involve big treaties or negotiations.
Look, I think there are various elements here, and I say this is a big customer of Pernod Ricard. I'm a big fan of your products. Thank you. you know, I think the business relationship is very important, but this is where I think the fundamentals of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement are exceptionally good, because the reality is that, you know, this has been a difficult divorce. Let's not pretend otherwise. It has been difficult, but actually, you know, the fundamentals of the relationship going forward have kept open an extraordinarily cooperative trading relationship, and I think that's, you know, huge credit to all sides. And I think the Prime Minister and his interlocutors on the other side need proper praise for that. I think the point about Charles's point about this is the worst French relationship that the UK has had for a long time. I mean,
Maybe worse.
You know, I genuinely, personally live the French relationship every day. And what I can say is it's been difficult. There have been, we've had better moments. But there is a fundament to it that I think many other countries ignore, which allows it to look worse on the surface than the reality. Because actually, the depth of the Entente Cordiale is no longer based on, you know, an agreement in 1905. It's based on a really deep partnership built up in 2 world wars, an exceptional period of economic cooperation, a genuine understanding of the world through similar, not the same, but similar eyes in terms of economies and approaches to, you know, former colonial structures and to a new way of looking at the world. And I think this means that the relationship, yeah, look, it is difficult, Charles. I mean, I get that. And I'm not going to tell you that I think that the Elysée has been the easiest interlocutor of these last couple of years, and nor that they've been reasonable on everything. I certainly don't think they have. But there is a depth to the relationship which is much more than the surface that we're seeing today. And this is where I think we should come to the point about Russia, China, other authoritarian states. And it's very easy, I think, if you're sitting in Moscow or Beijing, to look at Europe today and say, or the Europe-NATO alliance or wider areas like that, or to see, you know, decisions by friends like Turkey to buy things like the Russian S-400, or look at things like the AUKUS deal to see the reaction the French have given, all the decisions that the United Kingdom and the US made, and say, look, this is the alliance falling apart. This is it, you know, this is our moment. It's really not, guys. You know, if you make that bet, you're going to lose. Because the reality is that free peoples, all the way from Ankara to Dublin, will regularly disagree. And we will regularly disagree publicly, because we have free medias, we have diplomats who speak out. Zhao, I see you there. You know, we have members of parliaments from across our countries who will criticize their governments volubly and often with passion. And we will see the noise that is the truth of democracy. And people will say, oh, well, you're divided, you're split, you can't win, this is terrible, you're all falling apart. But the truth is, no, that's not right. What you're seeing is you're seeing the strength of the system. You're seeing the strength of free peoples who can disagree publicly and vocally. But when pushed, do come together, really come together. And you see that whether you see, for example, and I'm going to pick on the Irish Republic for a moment because I see you sitting here. I know you're a European for this purpose, but forgive me. But no, I know. But you see, look at the way that the Irish Republic has responded to the Afghan crisis. Look at the extraordinary welcome that they've made to Afghan citizens, many of whom had nothing to do with Ireland. I mean, Ireland did have some troops in Afghanistan, but actually very few. And look at the welcome that they've made, not because Ireland itself had a personal debt to these people, but because the Irish people recognize that they are part of a wider cooperation. They're not even part of NATO, and that was a NATO operation. Look at what the Irish people have done. Look at what various people around Europe have done, recognizing that there is such a thing as the West. There is such a thing as partnership of free countries. There really is such a thing as alliances. And yeah, look, the noise for the last few years has been difficult. Of course it's been difficult. Divorces are ugly. But the reality is we are going to go to the kids' wedding in a few years' time and the graduation ceremonies and all those sort of things. Because actually we are in this together, and there's another 3,000 years to go. And, you know, hopefully more, exactly. And if the 3,000 years looks more like the last 70 than many of the periods of 70 years before, then do you know what? That's fine.
Well, Charles, your last remarks has made me feel I was rather Panglossian in in being positive about our relationship with our European neighbours. But I mean, I do stick with that. Of course, I appreciate that there are some very real difficulties in terms of the UK's relationships with France at the moment. AUKUS is one, bivalve molluscs is another. But I do think, like Tom, at its heart, the relationship is strong between the UK and France and continues to be exceptionally strong between the UK and the European Union. Yes, there are incredibly important issues to resolve in relation to Northern Ireland. They must be resolved. There are also all sorts of issues in the way the TCA operates, and we need to listen to the concerns, for example, of touring musicians. But these problems can be resolved, and I think their continued existence should not blind us to the fact that we remain, incredibly close partners with France and with the other members of the European Union. And I'm sure that will continue indefinitely because it is hugely in the interests of both sides that it does.
Thank you very much to everybody for listening for so long. It's been a great discussion. Thanks also to Greg, who was here with us earlier. Now, I can tell you the CER is going to go and coming to Tory party conferences for another 23 years, promoting debate and argument, trying to get everybody to understand each other's point of views a little bit better than they otherwise would do so. Can we have a round of applause for our panellists, please? Thank you. Thanks, that's great. Thank you both. That's great.